to another episode of the Philosophy Salon. This episode of the Philosophy Salon will be the first of a multi-part series focusing on examining the origins of philosophy. And our focus will be on the origins of Western philosophy, although our speculations regarding the origins may also be applicable to Eastern philosophy as well. The primary philosophical problems of our discussions will be: what are the origins of philosophy? What is knowledge of the origins? Why is knowledge of the origins of philosophy interesting and important? Well, let's consider some possible answers to that question. The investigation of the origins of philosophy is fruitful because we strive to know. This striving to know is a fact of human nature. And as Aristotle rightly says, quote, "All men desire to know," unquote. And that's from his Metaphysics, the opening line. So we naturally desire to know the origins or causes of phenomena, and origins are causes. Thus, to strive to know origins is to strive to know causes. To investigate the origins of philosophy, therefore, is to investigate its causes. These causes are partly psychological and partly environmental. We'd like to consider the proposition that there are multiple factors that any adequate account of the origins of philosophy needs to acknowledge. The relevant factors that we will consider are as follows. First, there are natural factors. For example, human nature. We'll ask, to what extent does philosophy arise from human nature? To what degree might the tendency to philosophize be part of our psychological nature, our biological nature? And when we're thinking of natural factors, we might think in terms of personality or certain personality traits. We might think of the role that evolution has played in shaping our natures and how that has affected our tendency towards being philosophical. Another set of factors we might consider in considering the origins of philosophy are what we might call historical factors. And with regards to these factors, we might ask several relevant questions, such as to what extent does philosophy arise out of human history? What were the historical conditions that gave rise to philosophy? In what way did ancient myths and cultural institutions that they grew out of serve as the precursors for philosophy? Can we trace a historical lineage of philosophy back to a particular historical period, time, place, or person? Can we say that so-and-so was the first philosopher and why? And then we might then consider what might be called multiple factors, natural and historical. And in this respect, we can ask, to what extent does philosophy arise out of both human nature and human history? To what extent does our tendency to philosophize arise out of a combination of our psychological nature and the historical conditions of a given epoch? But the focus of this podcast will be on an examination of the historical factors that may have contributed to the origins of Western philosophy. And we want to, in analyzing this approach, we want to assess what might be called the historical approach to the question of the origins. And we will be investigating what is often considered the most well-known and influential formulation of the historical approach to philosophy, that espoused by F.M. Cornford in his classic work, From Religion to Philosophy, and as well as other approaches that might come up in the course of our conversation. For the lecture portion of our conversation, I'll be limiting my examination of the origins to the more rational and scientifically minded strains of ancient philosophy, as represented by the Milesian philosophers, especially Anaximander, as well as the atomists, Democritus and Leucippus. And our analysis will focus less on the origins of the more emotional and mystical strain of ancient Greek philosophy, as represented especially by thinkers such as Pythagoras and Empedocles. But our future series of conversations will turn to that tradition for sure. So although I might for the sake of discussion, discuss these mystical approaches in brief. So just to sort of provide some comparison and some contrast to the scientific approach. And I'm happy, Ryan, in our open-ended part of our conversation, if you want to bring any of that material to bear on the origins of philosophy, I'm happy to discuss that. But my primary focus will be on the scientific strain of Western philosophy and the historical factors that influenced its development, if you're all right with that.
Yeah, I think let's try to limit the discussion to just the historical factors as much as possible. There's so much we can get into, so yeah, let's try to limit our discussion a bit.
Yes, for sure. I think that always makes for a good conversation if we can keep it within those constraints, because I feel like there's lots of rabbit holes we could definitely go down. So before delving into the central tenets of the historical approach to the origins of philosophy, let's take a brief inventory of the central approaches that we will be examining over the course of this series of podcasts to better orient ourselves to the discussion. So the first of these approaches is what I'm calling the naturalistic approach, and it considers those natural factors that I've already mentioned. And this naturalistic approach relates to this philosophical notion of naturalism. And naturalism's an approach to philosophy that consists in viewing nature as the origin of things and as the source of existence. And it involves explaining everything as natural phenomena. And the proposition that philosophy arises in human nature is a view that has an ancient lineage. So in the Metaphysics, Aristotle writes, quote, "For it is owing to their wonder that men both begin and at first began to philosophize. They wondered originally at the obvious difficulties, then advanced little by little, and stated difficulties about the greater matters, e.g., about the phenomena of the moon and those of the sun and of the stars, and about the genesis of the whole. And a man who is puzzled and wonders thinks himself ignorant, whence even a lover of myth is in a sense a lover of wisdom, for the myth is composed of wonders. Therefore, since they philosophized in order to escape from ignorance, evidently they were pursuing science in order to know, and not for any utilitarian end. For all men begin, as we said, by wondering that things are as they are." Unquote. And that's from Aristotle's Metaphysics, Book 1, Chapter 2. So what Aristotle is claiming is that philosophy originates in human nature, and in the human tendency to wonder about the mind, the soul or self, and such a claim is true of the naturalistic approach more generally. Now, in contrast to the naturalistic approach, the historical approach holds that a certain peculiar set of historical conditions determined that philosophy began in a certain time and place with the utterances of a certain man, and that therefore the particular things that he first said and the particular pre-philosophical conditions out of which his sayings arise are of central importance in understanding the origins of philosophy. The final approach I'd like to consider holds that philosophy originates from a multiplicity of factors, including the interplay between historical and natural factors. We might call this an integrative approach. Bertrand Russell, the eminent historian of Western philosophy, lends credence to this view. To the question of the origins of philosophy, he offers the following answer, quote, "Ever since men became capable of free speculation, their actions, in innumerable important respects, have depended upon their theories as to the world and human life, as to what is good and what is evil. This is as true in the present day as at any former time. To understand an age or a nation, we must understand its philosophy. And to understand its philosophy, we must ourselves be in some degree philosophers. There is here a reciprocal causation. The circumstances of men's lives do much to determine their philosophy. But, conversely, their philosophy does much to determine their circumstances." What Russell is claiming, to paraphrase and to extrapolate, is that the origins of philosophy can be understood by the reciprocal interaction between historical factors that is, a person's circumstances, and natural factors, that is, a person's philosophy, which is an outgrowth of that person's nature. So that's a summary of the basic approaches we're going to be taking to understanding the origins of philosophy and analyzing the various theories and arguments that have been put forth for the origins of philosophy. And before delving into the historical approach to the origins of philosophy, I just want to take a brief pause and ask you, Ryan, what you think of all of that. Does that make sense? Is this how you might formulate approaching the question of the origins? And I'm just curious in general what you think of the preceding approaches and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a pretty natural way of wanting to break down, the factors. It's like, environment or nature versus nurture kind of argument. And I feel like Bertrand Russell is maybe offering from the multiple factors kind of like a both option a little bit. So I'm excited to see what we have to go into with the naturalistic approach and the historical approach, just to kind of see like how those might interact with one another.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think it's a good reflection, and I think that philosophy is never an either or game. There's always either or and, right? There's always there's always an addition you can make to an argument. It's not just any argument is neither a rigid disjunction, either this or that, but there's a multitude of factors that always can come into play in considering any philosophical question, I think. But in any case, I don't want to digress too much, but just to take note of that. So, beginning with a historical approach, I'd like to, having taken inventory on the differing approaches to considering the origins of philosophy, I'd now like to turn to the historical approach espoused by Cornford, which will be the first in our analysis of the origins of philosophy. To begin, Cornford's fundamental thesis about the origins of philosophy is implied by the title of his work, and it pervades the work as a whole. And which is this: he holds that the thesis that philosophy originates from the older religious myths of earlier, more primitive Greek society. So let's examine some representative passages from Cornford's work to better grasp the full scope of his thesis. So, in the preface to the work, he lays out the view that philosophy arises out of a specific mythological and religious principle, the principle of the nature of things, or what the ancients called physis. Physis, the nature of things, is what Cornford claims to be the datum of philosophy, from which we can deduce the emergence of the proceeding philosophical concepts formulated by the so-called first philosophers, the pre-Socratics, beginning with the first and foremost, Thales. Regarding this datum, Cornford writes, quote, "I have called it the datum of philosophy to mark that it was not invented by the philosophers, but derived from a representation which underlies all shapes and symbols of religious thought." Unquote. In the preface, Cornford further notes that the development of philosophy out of older religious myths essentially involves a shift of attitude toward the datum of philosophy, a shift from an emotional way of perceiving the nature of things to a more rational way of perceiving it. The emotional way sees the nature of things as supernatural in character. The rational sees the nature of things as metaphysical. Regarding this radical shift in attitude, Cornford writes, quote, "What has changed is, rather, man's attitude towards it, that is, the nature of things, which, from being active and emotional, has become intellectual and speculative. His earlier emotional reaction gave birth to the symbols of myth, to objects of faith. His new procedure of critical analysis dissects it into concepts, from which it deduces various types of systematic. In tracing the origins of philosophy, Cornford distinguishes between two philosophical traditions: philosophy in the scientific tradition versus philosophy in the mystical tradition. So let's briefly characterize each. And as noted, the focus of our discussion will be on philosophy in the scientific tradition. So the scientific tradition is characterized as the tendency to deeply master the world by understanding it, with the goal of formulating the most perspicuous and parsimonious model of it possible in order to explain all phenomena. The scientific tradition sees its inception beginning with the Milesian philosophers of Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes, and sees its culmination in the Ionian school of the atomists of Leucippus and Democritus. Those philosophers who are representative of this tradition are driven by a unique temperament, perhaps more rational, and such an approach is based upon the need to master the world by understanding it. And the mystical tradition contrasts the scientific tradition in that it is less driven by a need to master the world through understanding it, and is driven more by a need to live life according to certain beliefs about the nature of the divine and human destiny. The mystical tradition converges with the scientific tradition insofar as each holds that the world is rational. It diverges with it, however, in striving to justify faith with reason. The mystical tradition can be traced to representative philosophers such as Heraclitus and Pythagoras and Empedocles. And these philosophers are, again, driven by a unique temperament, perhaps more emotional, and as mentioned, based upon a need to articulate an understanding of the divine in relation to human destiny, which includes an understanding of how to comport oneself to the divine. And maybe just to add as a side note, throughout the discussion, I don't mean to imply by any means that the scientific tradition and the mystical tradition are mutually exclusive. I would even argue that so-called more scientifically minded philosophers, such as the Milesian school and the atomistic school, might have aspects of their philosophies which border on the mystical. And similarly, I think that the mystically minded philosophers would also adhere to various rational and logical and scientific principles characteristic of the scientific tradition. So I would say then that these two different approaches are perhaps on a continuum, on a spectrum, and the various philosophers might, in the scientific tradition, might have more of the rationalist elements, whereas those of the mystical tradition might have more of the supernaturalist elements. But I would say that it's probably a difference of degree rather than of kind. And when we revisit the mystical tradition in our next discussion, that will probably become clearer as well. But in any case, that I digress. Let's get back onto the main thread here. So in the actual text, Cornford grounds his argument by demonstrating that the origin of several of the metaphysical concepts of the pre-Socratic philosophers, especially those from the Milesian school, can be traced back to mythical sources. First, that the origin of the nature of things, that is, physis, could be explained by a combination of the primordial elements, that is, water, air, fire, and earth, and by primordial forces or first principles, that is, the elements governed by a natural or a moral order, what we might call justice or fate. The philosophical exemplar that Cornford examines in substantiating his argument is Anaximander, but his argument could be generalized to the other pre-Socratic philosophers within the scientific tradition that I've mentioned. So regarding the first of these metaphysical concepts, we know from the later Greek historian Simplicius that Anaximander held, like the other pre-Socratics, that the nature of things could be explained by the four primordial elements: water, air, earth, and fire. And that's from Simplicius's Commentaria. So, according to Cornford, this metaphysical concept could be traced to the mythological conception that the nature of things could be portioned into separable provinces, each of which corresponds to the domain of one element. Regarding the second of these metaphysical concepts, we know from the only extant fragment of Anaximander that the generation and the dissolution of these elements was governed by a more fundamental first principle, what Anaximander called the apeiron, which means that which is unlimited, boundless, infinite, and indefinite. Anaximander characterizes the unlimited as follows, quote, "The unlimited is the first principle of things that are. It is that from which the coming to be of things and qualities takes place, and it is that into which they return when they perish, by moral necessity, giving satisfaction to one another and making reparation for their injustice, according to the order of time." Unquote. From this first principle, it would follow that the coming to be and the ceasing to be of the elements is governed by a natural order, a moral order, what Anaximander refers to as a moral necessity. This moral order is transgressed during the perpetual process of birth and death. When an individual substance is born anew, it involves the plundering of one element by another element, and this act of plundering constitutes an injustice, the penalty of which is death and dissolution. Put differently, reality itself is governed by opposing forces, the opposing forces of cosmic injustice and cosmic justice. The ceasing to be of one element, say fire, and the coming to be of another element, say water, is a valuation whereby the cosmos judges that one element ought to predominate over another, as just reparation for the injustice committed by one element becoming predominant over the other. Issues of value and morality are thus woven into the fabric of the cosmos itself on a micro scale, say on the scale of human beings or of the elements and so on, and also on the macro scale, on the scale of the cosmos. So as Cornford puts it, quote, "No single thing can begin to exist without an infraction of the destined order. Birth is a crime, and growth an aggravated robbery," unquote. According to Cornford, this metaphysical concept of the unlimited that governs the generation and the dissolution of the elements and the natural order, more generally by moral necessity, can be traced back to another mythological conception, that nature is ordered by the power of necessity and right. This power is what the ancients called Moira, which may be defined as destiny or fate. To a first approximation, Cornford argues that this concept of fate, which can be traced back to ancient Greek mythology, this concept of fate can be traced back to ancient Greek mythology from which philosophy arises. So, Ryan, what do you think at this stage of any of the preceding? Does this thesis make sense? And what do you think of how Cornford conceptualizes his origins explanation of the origins of philosophy in terms of these historical factors?
Yeah, I think a lot of it's pretty interesting. I didn't read a lot of Cornford, but I did some adjacent reading, and from what I found, the picture of like Greek religious life was very much centered around the family and private household worship of gods. And so like you would have your house, which would essentially be a temple, and you would have your property, which in the Greek mind and in the Greek tradition is like that property is essentially like animated, and the gods like live there. Like whatever gods that you are privately worshiping in your house, like they, through your altar, through your temple, they're welcome into your home and on your land, and they like live in the land. And you have your property, and in between each property there's like a cordon off section of land that nobody owns, and then the next property. So it's very much aligning with what Cornford is saying about how each element kind of has its own section and its own place, and talking about like justice and injustice of like one element taking over the other. So it's very much like mirroring Greek family culture and social relations between families and how you like worship and live. So I think that's a pretty accurate interpretation, and it at least maps onto what I've read about Greek religion and Greek culture.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. I hadn't conducted any research on that myself, but like you pointed out, I think it's definitely congruent with Cornford's argument. And more or less from what I heard you say was that sort of the arrangement of the household in ancient Greek times um, was sort of a concrete embodiment of sort of the more abstract way of um, conceptualizing, um, you know, the origins of things, and we'll elaborate on that further as we go along. It's an interesting argument, but that's interesting. I'd like to talk to you about that in some more depth, maybe later on in the open-ended conversation. But in any case, let's turn to the mythical text used to justify Cornford's thesis. So Cornford's primarily appeals to two cornerstone texts of Western philosophy, Hesiod's Theogony and Homer's Iliad, to justify his thesis that philosophy originates in mythology. He points out that the conceptual parallels and divergences between the mythic poets, Hesiod and Homer, and the pre-Socratic philosophers, especially within the scientific tradition, support his thesis. So let's look at some of these convergences, and let's first start with Hesiod. An examination of Hesiod's cosmogony illustrates the conceptual parallels and divergences with Anaximander and the pre-Socratics more generally. Hesiod, like Anaximander, divides the world into elemental provinces that are ordered by the necessity of fate. Hesiod's cosmogony begins with the genesis of chaos, earth, and eros, and from chaos, darkness and night arise, and from them, fire and daylight are born. Then the world is divided into three discrete parts or provinces: earth, sky, and sea. These provinces for Hesiod are so divided according to the ordinances of fate. Similarly, in Homer, we see a similar division of the world into the same three elemental provinces, each of which is assigned to a particular god. Zeus governs the sky, Poseidon governs the sea, and Hades governs the earth. As to fate, Hesiod explains that night gives birth to the destinies, the Moirai, who bestow the moral order upon the world, which includes bestowing the capacity to do good and evil within each human being, as well as controlling moral transgression, a control that neither human beings nor even the divine beings may escape. Within the writings of Homer, moreover, we have a similar conception of fate. Now, as to the divergences, the pre-Socratic philosophers, beginning with the Milesian school of philosophers, Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes, represent a fundamental divergence from the mythic predecessors, and so deserve the accolades of being the first philosophers, according to Cornford. Thus, from them onward, philosophy is clearly demarcated from mythology. What precisely distinguishes philosophy from mythology from Cornford's perspective? For Cornford, the difference is a shifting from a supernatural way of explaining the nature of things, which is typical of mythology, to a rational way of explaining the nature of things, which is typical of philosophy. Specifically, this rational way of explaining the nature of things, he suggests, was demonstrated in the attempt of the Milesians to formulate hypotheses regarding the nature of things, each of whom proposed that the nature of things could be accounted for by one primary stuff. So Thales proposed that the fundamental stuff was water. Anaximander proposed that it was the unlimited. Anaximenes proposed that it was air, and so forth. And each defended their proposal through rational argumentation, by appealing to principles of logic, of cause and effect, and so forth. Cornford suggests that the pre-Socratics Cornford suggests that with the pre-Socratics we see, quote, throwing off the vast symbolic visions of mythology and waking clear-headed, to see and touch real things. If we have a rational temperament, we feel at once a refreshment. Here at last is its statement about the world which is meant and offered as true, a logos, not a mythos." Unquote. It's precisely in explaining the nature of things according to the principles of logos, not of mythos, that distinguishes the pre-Socratics, the first philosophers, from the mythic poets, and which thus marks the beginnings of philosophy. What differentiates the first philosophers from the mythic poets, Cornford contends, is that they replace supernatural explanations with natural explanations. Appeals to causal rather than supernatural explanation predominates. Appeals to reason over revelation are viewed as primary modes of knowing the natural order. For example, causation is not explained by the gods, who are personifications of causal forces, but they are explained by natural causes. In the case of Anaximander, for example, they're explained in terms of, say, the eternal motion. So this is perhaps the fundamental point of difference. The only vestigial influence of myth upon philosophy was twofold, according to Cornford. First was the endurance of the concept of fate, understood as that force of necessity that establishes and arranges the natural order according to discrete elements. Second was the endurance of the concept of justice, understood as the moral order, and both of which are somewhat synonymous. But in each case, the ordinances of fate and justice are not divinely sanctioned by gods, but exist as facts or laws of nature. And let's turn now to, first of all, let's just take a pause. As far as my exposition of all of that material, Ryan, what do you think of that? Does it make sense? What comes up for you?
Sorry. Yeah.
That's okay. We'll clip this out.
Yeah. Yeah, no, sorry. I was just looking something up. That's why I had my mic off. I didn't want you to hear my typing.
That's all fine.
Okay. So, yeah, I think Nietzsche here points out the same thing that Cornford does about moving from sort of a mythos to a logos as being one of the main points. So going from supernatural explanations to more a naturalistic approach. But one of the other things is encompassing sort of the explanation under one element, like one thing, like everything is one. I think that is something that Nietzsche says that's something that makes Thales the first Greek philosopher. So having sort of this overarching unified explanation and boiling everything down to sort of, one principle is maybe perhaps one other thing we could add to that, or Cornford could have added to his argument. But otherwise, I'd say that that's a pretty good conception that Cornford has.
Yeah, I think that's a good observation you make there, Ryan, about Nietzsche and his remark about how Thales should be considered amongst the first philosophers because of the effort that he made to conceptualize reality in terms of this overarching first principle. For him it was that everything was water, right? And that kind of more abstractly boils down to the statement, everything is one, insofar as everything is an aspect or a part of water. And I think that Cornford would be friendly to that type of, analysis of the origins.
Yeah, I think the translation for what Thales says, I could be wrong, is better translated as like water is the womb of all things. So like emphasizing sort of that origin aspect as well. So again, getting into, philosophy, getting into, what are the origins? What is the first principle of everything?
Yeah, no, I think the language is apt for expressing that idea. This metaphor of emerging from the womb, this watery womb, and I think that captures nicely the gist of what Thales is saying, and I think that sort of metaphor could be extended to across the board to the other pre-Socratics as well. So in any case, let's continue on with our analysis of Cornford's explanation of the origins from the historical approach. And aside from Cornford's first and fundamental thesis that philosophy originates from mythology, there is a second and third argument he presents that pervades the examinations of the mythic origins of philosophy. The second argument seems to vacillate with the first, for he claims that religious myths of the poets Hesiod and Homer and the metaphysical explanations of the pre-Socratics are two ways of characterizing the same phenomena, the nature of things, the origin of things, but in different ways. We'll consider in a moment how the second claim is more plausible than the first, at least from my perspective. And in any event, Cornford's second argument claims mythology and philosophy seek to explain the nature of things, what we might call the explanatum. But the way that they explain the nature of things, what we might call the explanans, involves different language. He writes that mythical religion, quote, expresses itself in poetical symbols and in terms of mythical personalities, unquote, while, quote, philosophy prefers the language of dry abstraction and speaks of substance, cause, matter, and so forth. Thus, unquote. Thus, the language of mythology is defined by poetical symbols, while the language of philosophy is defined by abstractions. Indeed, Anaximander's great philosophical contribution, as Cornford notes, is his movement towards understanding the nature of things abstractly, by recourse to a first principle, that is, the unlimited, and in his movement away from understanding the nature of things concretely, by recourse to visually observable and sensible aspects, such as water, fire, air, and earth. Although there are surface differences in the language used, beneath these differences, each is seeking to explain the nature of things, the nature of which is material, living, and divine. Let's further clarify the nature of these linguistic differences proper to myth and philosophy, and ascertain the extent to which the former and the latter are different modes of representing the nature of things. So, to begin, mythology employs a mode of explanation that can be clarified by considering its etymology, the ancient Greek term mythos, from which myth comes from. So mythos means speech, narrative, fiction, myth, plot. A related term, mythologia, is a term used by Plato to indicate fiction and storytelling. The term mythologia was later used by the term mythologia was used by the Latin writer of late antiquity, Fulgentius, to refer to the origin stories depicted in allegories. Myths were viewed as allegories requiring interpretation, and were not viewed as true events. The modern term mythology means the exposition and the interpretation of myths, allegory, and also to personification. Philosophy, on the other hand, employs a mode of explanation grounded in a principle, the logos. Logos is a concept in philosophy that has many meanings. The basic and ordinary meaning of logos is word, speech, or reason. In Western philosophy, Heraclitus was the first to use the word logos in a more technical sense. First, he conceived of it as a rule, principle, or law. As a principle, Heraclitus considered it to be the principle that all things are one, as well as the principle of order and knowledge common to everything. He conceived of it as a law of change, a law according to which all things become different, alter, and transform. In this sense, we might think of the logos as rules of logic, mathematics, as a principle of cause and effect, or as laws of physics. Other technical meanings of logos include the following. It can be thought of as sentence, proposition, account, explanation, thesis, and argument. It may be considered reason, reasoning, and the rational faculty, or abstract theory. It can be taken to be measure, proportion, or ratio. Finally, it can be viewed as value or as worth. Putting all these ideas together, we might say that philosophy and mythology are two modes of explaining the nature of things, two modes of explaining the truth. The former is grounded in mythos, and the latter is grounded in logos. So just to take a pause and reflect here, Ryan, what do you think of the exposition of this material and of Cornford's second argument?
Yeah. In particular, the first bit there about mythology and philosophy being two ways of explaining the same thing. I think he's got that. He's got that pretty well well described, I would say. My conception of it is a little different, and let me know what you think of it. But I see mythology or the mythos as having sort of a different locus of explanation. Mythos sort of uses the self, like the human being, as the measure, as the, in mythology but anyways, so in myth we often personify, whatever ideas or principles or concepts we're dealing with. And I think that's because with mythos, what we're doing is we're using ourselves as a way of explaining the world. Whereas like logos or philosophy, what it's doing is it's using sort of nature in some way to explain nature. It's sort of like an external locus of explanation. So with Anaximander, like the boundless, like, nature's constantly changing. Everything's constantly in flux around us. Or, just using water with Thales as the explanation for things, as opposed to, some sort of god positioned in some sort of allegory or mythological relation to human beings. So yeah, I think he's got this mapped on pretty well. If my way of conceiving it is the same as Cornford's.
Yeah, I think you both have a similar conception. I feel like you've offered some additional insights as well that go beyond Cornford. I liked your way of formulating the difference too, in terms of how myth and philosophy have different locuses of explanation, as you put it. That myth has this internal locus of explanation in which man is taken as the measure of all things, kind of that's sophistic dictum, right? That Protagoras uttered. But I think it also applies to myth, and what does that mean mythically? Well, the gods, for example, Homer's gods, all are more or less copies of human beings, maybe glorified copies, but, they retain all the elements of a human being. They have all the personal qualities and, even the explanation of the elements as well are personified, and fate itself is personified. And it's this act of personification, which I think is what you're kind of getting at when you're saying that mythology takes as its locus of control human beings. It's a way of modeling our explanation of the universe upon the human, which contrasts, the philosophical approach, which is to, in which, nature becomes the measure of everything, right? And we shift to this external locus of explanation. And in Thales, for example, everything is explained as arising from water. and all the processes within nature in some respect have some reference to water. So I think that that's a good way of articulating it. So in any case, to move on now to Cornford's third argument, his final argument is more foundational. So if you recall, Cornford first argues that philosophy is founded upon religious myth, but he goes on to argue that ultimately religious myth is founded upon social factors, namely social customs, which is to say the structure and the institutions of the human group. He argues that, quote, behind philosophy lay religion. Behind religion, as we now see, lies social custom, the structure and institutions of the human group. Unquote. To begin, he suggests that mythology originates in a scheme of representation, which is a projection of the social customs and institutions of an earlier and more primitive ancient Greek society. He suggests that, quote, from another point of view, which will be clear from what has gone before, philosophy rediscovers in the world that very scheme of representation which had, by a necessary process, been projected into the world from the structure and institutions of society in its earliest stages of development. Unquote. More specifically, Cornford refers to this scheme of representation as a collective representation. The nature of a collective representation involves a multitude of defining features. I'll briefly summarize these features, which were first formulated by the French sociologist Levi Bruhl, if I've got that right. They are first common, so collective representations are first common to all members of a specific social group and are transmitted from one generation to another. They are imposed upon the individual of such groups and evoke powerful feelings and emotions towards the objects that they represent. Feelings of respect, emotions of fear, and adoration. Such representations do not depend upon the individual or the social group, but upon the collective social group, such that they can only be understood by reference to the group as a whole. Thus, language such as the language of mythology and philosophy inherently depends upon the social group. Such a representation precedes and endures the generations. It exists before each member is born and continues to exist after each member dies. The next step in Cornford's argument with regards to this third argument is that the concepts of fate and the division of the material universe into elemental provinces is itself a collective representation in the sense described above. Such representations are imposed by what Cornford calls herd suggestion. Herd suggestion involves the imposition of a collective representation by either initiation or by enforcement by the dominant social group, that is, by the herd. Mythologies are imposed and transmitted like contagion by the herd. Myths have, as a defining feature, an emotional charge, whereas the proto-scientific theories of the pre-Socratics do not. And this marks the transition from mythology to philosophy. The pre-Socratics, in other words, inherited the collective representation of the ancient primitive Greeks, but without the emotional contagion. Now, to better understand how a collective representation operates in primitive society, we need to elaborate on the concept of totemism. Totemism is a social system in which the fundamental collective representation has become an enduring conceptual framework. Such systems are comprised of totems. A totem is based on the group, not the individual. A totem is a class of objects, just like the clan is a class of people. Totems are socially significant such that they become salient to the group. They are what matters to the group. For example, totems are relevant to the physiological need of food, such as certain consumable species that make up food, broccoli or carrots or lettuce or so on. Or totems are also pertinent to the food supply the sources of the food supply, which we might say are the elements, right? The wind and the rain and the sun. Those are also instances of totems. A totem represents the tribe, the social group, and such a group embraces human, animal, and non-human members. The members of a totemic tribe believe themselves to be descendants of a totem ancestry, often conceived as half plant or animal. This is a mythic representation that defines the clan's identity. Another core concept relevant to Cornford's argument, this third argument we're going over right now, is this concept of nomos. So we've gone over logos and mythos. Here's another word ending in os, nomos. Put simply, the mythology and philosophy of the ancient Greeks is modeled upon nomos. Nomos is moral necessity in the conduct of life within a tribal group. That is, that which one ought to do and must do within the context of a tribal group. Such actions are conceived of by its members as expressions of peculiar magical powers within a group's shared mythology. But such actions lose their magical connotations when a group transitions from a shared mythology to a shared philosophy. A group's actions are no longer animated by magic, but by natural causes, psychological, biological, physical causes. So putting all of these ideas together, let's consider how Anaximander's cosmological theory with its theoretical constructs, that of the fundamental stuff of the universe, the unlimited, as well as the eternal motion and the four elements, can be traced back to the totemic tribal structures of primitive Greeks. Putting these ideas together, let's consider how Anaximander's cosmological theory, with its theoretical constructs, that of the fundamental stuff of the universe, the unlimited, as well as the eternal motion and the four elements, can be traced back to the totemic tribal structures of primitive Greeks. Put simply, the structure of Anaximander's cosmological theory mirrors the structure of the totemic tribe. Consider firstly how the fundamental component of the structure of his cosmology, the unlimited, mirrors the structure of the totemic tribe. The concept of the unlimited, apeiron, exhibits properties that are continuous, homogeneous, undifferentiated, and which are connected to a causal mechanism, that is, the eternal motion, that make the unlimited become parceled out into smaller groups, such as the four elements. Similarly, a fundamental component of the structure of the totemic tribe is the primitive herd, that is, likewise continuous, homogeneous, undifferentiated, and connected to a causal mechanism, the eternal motion, that makes the tribe become parceled out into smaller groups. Secondly, another component of the structure of Anaximander's cosmology, that of the four elements, is governed by the ordinances of fate or necessity, and this also mirrors the structure of the totemic tribe. So the four elements are differentiated and specialized, and they're united together in a homogeneous substance by the fatal necessity of a law of attraction, in which like draws like together. We might call this the solidarity of affinity amongst the... So these elements, moreover, can potentially be divided from one another into heterogeneous and individual substances by the fatal necessity of a law of repulsion, in which unlike elements repel unlike elements. And we might call this the war or feud that makes up the individual existence of all the elements. So similarly, like the elements, the structure of the totemic tribe is differentiated and specialized, and is united together in a homogeneous group by the fatal necessity of a law of attraction, in which like draws like together. So we may call this the solidarity of affinity with respect to individuals within a group. And the totemic tribe, moreover, can potentially be divided into heterogeneous and individual members, or maybe defectors, by a fatal necessity of a law of repulsion, in which like members or unlike members repel unlike members. And we might call this the war or feud that makes up the individual existence of the members of each group. So those are Cornford's three central arguments, and I've offered an exposition of them as far as I could. And I think that this provides a backdrop for perhaps a more open-ended conversation that we can have about maybe some of the central questions that are raised by Cornford's account of the origins of philosophy, his historical account. And I've formulated some pertinent questions which we can ponder and which we can address. The first of these is that simply, what are the origins of philosophy? Are they historical? The second of these is, what are the origins of philosophy? I guess within the scientific tradition, maybe we can discuss the mystical tradition tangentially, but I'm primarily interested in what are the origins of philosophy within the scientific tradition. Does philosophy originate in mythology? Are mythology and philosophy mutually exclusive, and to what extent are they different or similar? And does philosophy and mythology originate in the customs of ancient Greek society? So these are some pertinent questions that I think that his analysis of the origins of philosophy raises, at least for me. And I'd be happy to take up these questions and discuss them, or any questions that you might have, Ryan. Is there a place where you'd like to begin to start with?
Yeah, I actually would just like take a moment and go back to that last section there that you just went over. I just have a couple of thoughts.
Oh, sure. Yes. I guess I glossed over that without getting your 2 cents worth. So yeah, let's hear it.
Well, I was just wondering what you thought too, because to me it sounded very much like he was describing, like as he was describing sort of the relation of the elements, and it just brought to mind the different Greek states and how like they represent sort of different tribes, and there's sort of no one central authority amongst them, and a lot of the times they're disagreeing with each other, they're warring against each other, they're creating alliances, and all that sort of stuff. So it really does seem like Cornford is providing a solid argument for, history at least playing a role in the development of philosophy. So I guess to the first question, would you say that, just based on Cornford's argument, that the origins of philosophy are historical, or would you disagree with what he has to say so far?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I guess that's a fundamental question to ask. I think I have some ideas, and I think in the first place, I could take an argument against Cornford, and I could argue that the origins of philosophy are not purely historical. While there are historical influences, I think there are reasons to suppose that philosophy does not necessarily arise out of myth. And one criticism of this argument that's been made was one put forward by the philosopher True Highland in his work, The Origins of Philosophy. And in this, he argues that the historical approach to the question of the origins of philosophy is based upon circular reasoning, and in that the premises of Cornford's argument are in need of evidence just as much as his conclusion is. And I think, in agreement with Highland, I think that the evidence for Cornford's premises don't seem to be forthcoming, and I think we could scrutinize the putative evidence that he does provide. So let's examine. I want to examine this defect. So let's recall that Highland argues that philosophy originates in mythology, and his premises supporting this argument is that philosophy inherits the conceptual scheme of mythology, that of fate and destiny, the natural order, or the moral order governed by necessity, as well as the fundamental elements that compose the material universe, and which are governed by the operations of the natural and moral order. We may question whether the origins of this conceptual scheme indeed is from a mythological source. So, if philosophy indeed did arise from mythology, it begs the question, how is it that this conceptual scheme is mythological and not philosophical? And I think I could equally argue that the mythic poets such as Hesiod and Homer came up with their understanding of this conceptual scheme and gave it poetic expression in the symbols of myth, not because of a collective representation that's distinctly unphilosophical, but because they were poets of a philosophical nature. And if we recall that opening quote that I stated about with Aristotle, saying that, mythic poets themselves too can be lovers of wisdom, then perhaps my criticism has more validity. We might not say that Homer and Hesiod are bona fide philosophers by any means, but in the same way that we might not say Dostoevsky is a bona fide philosopher, but it would seem that all of those authors mentioned touch upon philosophical issues, and then I would have to think, taking the naturalistic approach perhaps, to say that, well, what's motivating them is this wonder, this wonder about the nature of things. And isn't that motivating force, or that that psychological tendency, isn't that philosophical rather than mythological? I suppose that's the thrust of the argument. And so to continue with that line of reasoning, perhaps the mythic poets were filled with those basic qualities that are defining of a philosopher: the desire to know, a curiosity about the universe, its fundamental mysteries, and so forth. And indeed, even the notion of a collective representation, I think, and its related concepts, have features that are definitive of philosophy, such as certain metaphysical presuppositions, such as the metaphysical understanding of the world in terms of fate and of the elements that hold sway over the elements. And I think that we might say, against Cornford, that the concepts of fate and the elements were abstractions that were first enacted in the customs of ancient tribal society. So maybe in the beginning there was the deed, were these customs, and then mythic poets were able to themselves formulate some abstractions based on those deeds, based on those practices. So in the beginning there was the deed, and then came the word, as it were. But I don't necessarily see a sharp divide between what the mythic poets were doing, what the pre-Socratics were doing. Maybe there's differences of degree we can talk about, but at a first approximation, at least, that's what I see as being one of the central criticisms of Cornford's approach. So tell me what you think about all of that.
Yeah, I think I would agree with part of what Hyland says. So I guess my criticism of Hyland's criticism would be that it ignores Cornford's it ignores the distinction between the philosophical treatment of these ideas and mythological treatment of these ideas, like fate. So like the Greeks still personified fate, for example, right? So like, yeah, these ideas existed, but they didn't exist in a philosophical way, I think is what Cornford might say. And that, but I agree with Hyland still, in that I don't think that Cornford makes the argument that philosophy originates from myth. I think he's right in pointing out that it sort of inherits the conceptual framework. But I think what underlies, and I think what is maybe confusing Hyland here, is what you pointed out in the Aristotle quote, which is wonder. So this sort of overarching wonder that human beings have, and we haven't got to this because this gets into the naturalistic stuff. I think that wonder is what drives both the mythic poet and the philosopher, and that is really what the origin is, and really the historical factors just explain the conceptual frameworks that kind of get inherited. it doesn't really explain the origin. It explains sort of, why it is maybe the way that it is, but it doesn't explain why it is at all. It doesn't really explain the true origin of it.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's succinctly put. I think that Cornford's analysis is demonstrating, I suppose in the same way that Darwin is explaining the origins of species in terms of like previous life forms becoming more increasingly complex or altering or transforming. In the same way, Cornford is explaining the origin of philosophy, in the sense of how philosophy, in its inception was influenced by previous forms of explanation that it inherited, just like, a species that comes into existence, how that inherits tendencies and characteristics from its predecessors, but it's essentially a new being, it's a new organism having its own distinctive and defining features, which I suppose gives it its identity and so on. The same sort of analogy and reasoning could be applied to maybe Cornford's approach. I think when I'm reading Cornford, I'm hearing kind of two things going on here. One thing I think he's saying is that philosophy inherits these concepts from mythology. So this is the convergence, but it also does away with certain ideas, certain concepts, or at least it modifies the concepts or the precisely, it modifies the concepts. So in the pre-Socratics we saw a movement away from personification of the elements to a movement towards creating an abstract explanation of them. So that's just one way. That's one case in point, and I think that marks a significant difference. And so yeah, no, I like your take on those issues. As to the similarities between, as to the third question I posed, does philosophy originate in mythology? What's your take on that point?
Yeah, I guess sort of gave it away in my previous answer, but I don't really think that it does. I think it's important to take into consideration when understanding, where a certain kind of philosophy comes from, like why it is the way that it is. But I don't necessarily think that it gives an explanation of why it is in the first place. Like why it is that philosophy arises at all in sort of any society. I mean, it might perhaps be that, Cornford is really just, looking at Greek philosophy here and saying, like, these are the particular factors that make Greek philosophy. Right. Taking for granted the naturalistic assumption that, like, of course, this, arises in multiple cultures out of wonder. You might talk to Cornford and he might say, well, of course, I did think I need to say that. I'm talking about a particular culture and a particular philosophy, and that's why I focused on the. But yeah, I think if we're looking at philosophy in general in Greece, I think that comes from wonder, but the philosophy as it arose in Greece, I think Cornford has some good information and good explanations.
Yeah, no, I see. It's like it's basically this is kind of just rehashing what we just previously talked about, maybe different words. I suppose that for me, at least to my first approximation, is that myth and philosophy are not necessarily distinct. That mythic poets and philosophical writers both raise issues that are philosophical, as we've discussed. I think that each exemplifies a defining aspect of the philosophical tendency, which is this tendency to wonder about the origin of things and of human beings as well. And that's getting back to, again, the Aristotle quote. So to this extent, I think that both mythic poets and philosophers stand as exemplars of the human tendency to wonder about the cosmos and man's place in it, which is itself a philosophical tendency. And I think that the similarity demonstrates that philosophy does not necessarily arise from myth. It arises from human nature defined by the natural inclination to wonder. So that's an alternative way of accounting for the origins. So that's my take on it. I mean, we might want to distinguish between sort of the philosophical tendency and philosophy more generally as an approach. Maybe the mythic poets show somewhat of the tendency, this love of wisdom, maybe, or this wonder, I should say, but perhaps they are lacking some of the other central aspects that are definitive of philosophy. Some of the ones that we've mentioned, and which Cornford mentioned in his analysis. This tendency to replace supernatural explanations with natural explanations, with logical explanations, with causal explanations. It would seem that the mythic poets are lacking those defining features. So perhaps there needs to be more conditions in place before we can say that so and so was the first philosopher. Perhaps it goes beyond mere wonder. Perhaps it starts in wonder, but what we define as a philosopher, requires more conditions for that definition to be, complete. So in any case, yes, that's my take, at least at a first approximation to this question of does philosophy originate in mythology? So I think I touched on the similarities between philosophy and mythology. I think there's also important differences. And I think that mythology and philosophy, though similar in being grounded in natural wonder, are also different. I think that mythic poetry is concerned primarily with the question of beauty, whereas philosophy is concerned primarily with the question of truth. And although there can be some, degree of overlap, which we can get into, I think Hyland puts it succinctly. He says, quote, and this is Hyland commenting on this difference between mythology and philosophy. So he says, quote, by beauty, in its broadest sense, we mean a concern with the manner in which a thing is presented, or, as Heidegger put it, its happening. The two concerns are in no way incompatible, and usually, certainly, in the case of the authors studied, the pre-Socratic philosophers, they overlap. So the suggestion in the context of Hyland's analysis is that Hesiod and Homer and the authors of the Epic of Gilgamesh are poets because, although they present philosophical issues and seem concerned to speak the truth, their work exhibits a more fundamental concern with the manner in which the truth is revealed, that is, with the happening of the work, or beauty. Thales, Anaximander, Anaximenes, and even Xenophanes, on the other hand, are philosophers because, or insofar as, they exhibit a fundamental concern with the truth of what they say, or rather, let me just back step here. So Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes, and even Xenophanes, on the other hand, are philosophers because, or insofar as they exhibit a fundamental concern with the truth of what they say, even though to be sure they evidence a genuine concern with the manner of presentation, even to the point of writing in a poetical style, in the case of Xenophanes and Anaximander. So, as Hyland's suggesting, the mythic poets are more concerned with the way that truth is presented in an aesthetic manner as an artistic composition, whereas the philosophers are concerned more with the expression of truth, most likely in abstract propositions. But again, Hyland is mindful that often philosophers themselves will adopt a poetical style, which we can get into. And so those are some of the differences, I think, noteworthy differences between myth and poetry.
I think.
What do you think of all that?
Yeah, I think myth. There's this element that wants to motivate the reader or the audience towards some sort of truth or sort of moral ideal in a sense. Like,
Mm-hmm.
it's concerned with, presenting a truth in a certain way that makes it palatable to the audience in a way that not only can they digest that truth, but then they see that as something worth striving for. You know what I mean? There's sort of like, and perhaps that's what the Greeks needed at that time, and that's sort of like part of the Greek spirit, as Nietzsche might suggest.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but with philosophy, it seems like there's a bit of that element remaining, but there is more of a move towards, like you've said, concern with truth and less of a concern with how it's presented and like making it palatable to a wide audience. You
Mm-hmm.
know what I mean? It, it's not something that is really concerned primarily with being a spectacle, a beautiful spectacle. It's not meant to be poetic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that point is well put. And I think that what I kind of heard you saying there is that, you know, myth is expressing itself um, poetically, figuratively, metaphorically, um, and as such, it's more well received by people, and perhaps it has more of an emotional resonance with people, such that it inspires them and it motivates them to live in accord with the truth. There's a saying, something like, um, "Truth is often enacted rather than stated or expressed." Um, and I think that's somewhat of what you were kind of getting at. Like we see in myth, whether it's Homer's Iliad or whether it's Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, we see characters embodying principles, embodying truths, in the um, visceral realities of life, or within a fantasy world, and that is more emotionally evocative, and it gets us. Um, it makes us have an emotional connection to the truth, and perhaps it makes us care about the truth. When we can see truth um, mirrored in art, we see that mirrored with flesh and blood people, and um, undergoing all the things that human beings undergo in their in their existence. It's something that perhaps makes the truth more relatable and impressionable. So no, I think those are good points and insights. I think that probably explains why a lot of people don't take to philosophy kind of in the more um, scholastic sense, of reading Aristotle and Spinoza, who often write very abstractly, and um, you know, who whose writings often are very void of metaphor and figurative language. But then again, we have other philosophers, which kind of this kind of anticipates these next final points that I'd like to make before we bring things to summation. Maybe that this is an appropriate place for me to jump into that, if you like. So I want to get into the shared interests of mythic poets and philosophers. So both mythic poetry and philosophy contemplate the nature or origins of things, I would contend, in some sense. So, for example, we haven't talked about this work over, in the exposition leading up to our conversation here, but I think it's noteworthy, for example, that the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's earliest epics, maybe one of the earliest or the earliest, at least within the Western canon, claims that reality is defined by perpetual flux rather than permanence, and that becoming has primacy over being. And this is perhaps the earliest recorded account of the theory that reality is a process. And The writer of the Epic of Gilgamesh, I think, anticipated Heraclitus' theories, Heraclitus being a pre-Socratic philosopher who we'll touch upon in our next podcast episode, I'm assuming. But the writer of the Epic of Gilgamesh anticipated Heraclitus' theories, which were nearly the same, because Heraclitus argued that the only enduring reality was mutability, as represented by the perpetual flux of fire. And the main difference between these two thinkers is the writer of Gilgamesh sought to convey truth, the nature of perpetual flux, in terms of metaphors that evoke an aesthetic sensory experience of concrete images of impermanence. So the writer of this epic claims, quote, "There is no permanence. Do we build a house to stand forever? Do we seal a contract to hold for all time? Do brothers divide an inheritance to keep forever? Does the flood time of rivers endure? It is only the nymph of the dragonfly who sheds her larva and sees sun in his glory. From the days of old, there is no permanence." Unquote. As such, we may say that the writer was more concerned with the beauty and in the expression of the truth, rather than in the direct or literal expression of truth, by using metaphors for impermanence. For example, a perishable house, the fleetingness of an inheritance, the waxing and waning of floods, the malleability of form in the class of insects. Whereas Heraclitus uses his language to convey the nature of impermanence directly, explicitly, though not exclusively in the form of propositions stated as aphorisms. I say not exclusively here because Heraclitus' writings are also rife with metaphors that evoke an aesthetic sensory experience that is typical of mythic poetry. For example, the metaphors of fire and of the flowing rivers that are used to represent implicitly, the metaphysical truth of an ever-changing reality. And so again, I think there's some overlap here in the way in which both the mythic poet and the philosopher express their ideas. Yes, mythic poets are primarily concerned with using metaphor and figurative language in expressing the truth, whereas philosophers perhaps are more interested in using abstract propositions. There are instances where the two approaches overlap. The philosopher will often use metaphor to get their point across, as in the case of Heraclitus. And we can think of other philosophers within the Western canon, Plato being a case in point, who writes in dialogues and in, stories and narratives, and uses allegories, like his famous allegory of the cave. And these are metaphorical and allegorical and poetical forms of expression that integrate with more philosophical modes of expression, of expressing points and abstractions and first principles and so on. So I do see a convergence, perhaps, in the way that philosophers and mythic poets can express themselves. And I don't necessarily see the two approaches in that sense being mutually exclusive, at least as far as the use of language goes. So in any case, that's my 2 cents on the shared interests of the mythic poets and the philosophers, and hopefully that touches upon some of the concerns you had about the relationship between the mythic poets and the philosophers. Is there anything you want to add to that, Ryan, or just thoughts more generally?
No, I think that pretty much summarizes everything that I was. Yeah, I think we're good.
Okay, yeah, I think we're good too. I think we've reached our limit for this conversation, at least. So, I guess on that note, let's bring things to summation. So in summary, we've examined the origins of philosophy within the scientific tradition, focusing on the historical conditions from which philosophy arose. The peculiar historical conditions examined was the mythology of the primitive Greek society and the social structure of the primitive Greek society underlying this mythology. In particular, we analyzed the core arguments of the historical approach that philosophy originates in myth and the structure of the mythic society as espoused by Cornford. We also analyzed Cornford's argument that philosophy departs from myth in that it is grounded in discerning reason, not undiscerning emotion. We offered our own criticisms of this historical approach, highlighting the particular weaknesses and strengths of the position. Our discussion focused primarily on historical factors that shaped the origins of Western philosophy within the scientific tradition, but did not consider the historical factors that shaped the origins of Western philosophy within the mystical tradition. So it is to those factors and to this tradition that our next series of discussions will focus on. But for the time being, we've reached the end of our current discussion. So all that remains to be said is, thanks for your time and attention, and be sage.